Welcome everybody, and today's video is all about photographing diving red kites. Now, I've loved these birds of prey as long as I can remember. They are absolutely stunning raptors with beautiful plumage. In flight they are just fantastic to watch and photograph. They're so graceful and acrobatic as well. It's incredible how acrobatic, how flexible these birds actually are, even capable of feeding on the wing. And there are a few feeding stations up and down the UK, including Giggering Farm in Wales and Argati up in Scotland. And I'm lucky enough here close to home to have a couple of locations where I can photograph them as well. So if you are off to a location to photograph these birds, then we're going to give you some tips on how you can capture them when they're diving. So I'm going to talk a little bit about choice of lens, which is obviously really important for birds in flight and certainly for this subject. Now personally, I much prefer something that I can hand hold. I just don't get on with tripods. I find them really restrictive for this type of photography. So something that I can hold, I just find I track the bird better. And I generally just get better results. So if you're the same, then size and weight is definitely going to be a big factor, and you want to have something as fast focusing as possible for this type of photography. That generally means the wider aperture lenses, but if you're shooting with something like this, which is f4, then it's probably going to be fast enough. So I think a good choice for this type of photography is like a mid telephoto lens. If you're close enough, then something like a 300mm lens I think is absolutely ideal. One of the reasons for this is it gives you a reasonable field of view. So if you have a 400, 500mm or even bigger, then the field of view just becomes much narrower and it makes it harder to find the bird and to follow it in flight. With a 300mm lens, then the field of view is wider. I think it's just generally easier for you to use. And one thing I would suggest as well, if you've got a focus limiter switch on the lens, which you probably have, just consider changing this so that it's more at the infinity end of the focus. That means it's not having to do as much work because it's not focusing at the nearer end, and hopefully that just makes the focusing a little bit faster. And it's really important that you have a comfortable shooting position. So when you're aiming up at those red kites in the sky, just find yourself what is the most comfortable position for you. It might be slightly different for everyone in terms of where your hand is on the lens. And that's going to depend a bit on the size of the lens and the camera and the weight distribution. So just get a comfortable position that you think is going to be best for you. Now in terms of lighting, I think generally it is best to have nice sunshine and clear blue skies to work with. Not only does it give a nice simple clean backdrop, but I think it also contrasts really well with the reds on the bird. Really nice eye-catching contrast. Having said that, I also think that dark clouds, where you get sort of grey clouds, a little bit moody, they can work really well for backgrounds as well. In terms of the camera settings, I think the first thing you want to do is make sure you've got the correct autofocus set, and you want to make sure if it's Canon that it's on servo, and if it's the other cameras then it's likely to be AFC. That is your continuous autofocus, which is going to keep tracking the bird to keep it in focus. As well as that, you want to have a really high frames per second. I would advise getting your frames per second as high as you can possibly do on your camera. In terms of aperture, I would keep the aperture fairly wide. The main reason being that it lets more light into the camera. That makes it easier to keep the shutter speed high. But I'll come back to the aperture a little bit more to mention on that one later on. And for shutter speed, you want to keep this really high. So personally, from experience, I would advise that you try and keep the shutter speed from 1/2500th, anything from there or higher, maybe up to 4,000th of a second. You can get these pictures on lower shutter speeds, but I think if you're over 2,000th, it definitely helps. Try not to overthink it too much. Just let the camera do the work. Just try and keep the bird in the frame as best you can, and just leave the autofocus to the camera. And I find that a lot of the time you're almost sort of dropping the camera because the bird can dive so quickly, just drop like a stone, that you pretty much have to do the same thing. So you probably find, you know, you're not just sort of following it down, you're almost like dropping the camera down to match the speed of the bird. So keep practicing, and above all, just keep persisting and take a lot of shots. When it comes to focusing, your autofocus area is going to be really important here. Now, you could potentially use a a single autofocus point, you could use expanded focus points, or even the zone area. And if you've got a mirrorless camera, you could also use the animal eye tracking as well. Now, I've had really good results with my R6 ever since I got it. I've used this for red kites, specifically photographing them diving. I was pretty much amazed at how well it did. On the eye focus, it did really well in tracking the birds as they dived, and I had a really good success rate, better than I would have probably ever had with the Canon DSLR. Now, that said, one of the issues I've found, particularly with red kites so far, if you use the eye tracking, I found sometimes it can actually focus on the wing. There's an area underneath the wing in terms of the plumage, maybe looks a little bit like an eye, maybe a darker area, but I found sometimes the focus has actually locked onto that. But generally speaking, the success rate I've had has been really good. If you're using a DSLR, then I'd probably suggest you're best using an expanded focus point, possibly even the wider, larger zone area. That's going to depend to some extent how close you are and how big the bird is in the frame. And I think it might be worth as well trying to stay slightly ahead of the bird. I know with my Canon 1DX, that would always be my technique, would always be to try and stay slightly ahead of the bird. I found that just helped the focus a bit, although having said that, it's going to be really hard to do that with a diving kite. Now, are there any specific techniques for capturing diving kites? Well, there's a few things that I've learned over the years that I think definitely help. So maybe you're at one of these feeding stations and they put out the food and the kites start to come in and you're getting ready to try and get that diving shot. What you'll probably find is that the kites tend to repeat a certain type of behaviour, is that they'll fly in and they'll probably circle for a while. So what usually happens is, the kite will probably circle higher up. Well, there's probably a number of them. They're going to circle around a bit higher up for a while, and then they're probably going to drop in height. So this is the key thing really, is to watch for the kites when they suddenly drop in height a little bit and then they start to circle. Then that is the time to really watch and really pay attention and really be ready. And eventually they're just going to twist and they're going to dive straight down. Now, my advice as well is to try and stick on one bird. Now, I know that's easier said than done, and sometimes I don't do it. And in this situation, you can have birds coming in from all angles and just piling in and diving down, and it's really tempting to just throw your camera up and just try and focus on anything. Try and resist that temptation. Try to pick on one bird, because it's probably going to dive at some point, especially if you get one maybe sort of on the periphery that's coming in, just starting to circle. I would try and concentrate, stick on that one bird, and then wait until it starts going into its dive. Now, even doing that, with this type of photography, you are likely to get a lot of unsuccessful images, and don't worry about that. That's absolutely normal, happens for me as well. So expect to get lots of kites that are not fully in the frame. Maybe they're half cut out, maybe the tail or wings is just chopped at the edge of the frame, and expect to get some that just aren't quite pin sharp or aren't in focus at all completely normal. Now, how should you focus? Should you use shutter button? Should you use back button focus? I really don't think it matters too much for this. I think it's just whatever you're used to and comfortable with. This is a very difficult thing to do, so the more comfortable you are, the better results I think you're going to get. Currently, I've got my Canon R6 set up for back button focus, and that includes the animal eye focus on one of the back buttons, and I've been having really good results with that. Now, if you really want to look at the focus system in more depth, then you could look at the different case settings. I did make a video a long time about this on the 1DX. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Entitled it an advanced birds in flight photography video. Now, the case settings are mostly affecting the responsiveness of the autofocus and the acceleration and deceleration. Now, it might be advantageous with diving kites to increase the acceleration, deceleration, because they're suddenly changing speed, so that might potentially help. There's different ways of looking at it. Generally, for my birds in flight photography, I prefer to have it more negative, because I prefer the focus to stay locked on all the time to my chosen bird. However, in this case, I think it might be better actually to be a bit more responsive, simply because you just want the focus to lock on and react as quickly as possible. On my Canon 1DX, I would have actually chosen case 6. That was to increase the responsiveness, the acceleration, deceleration, and to have autofocus point auto switching. Now your background can affect the focus to some extent. If you're photographing against a nice clear sky, it should be much easier for the focus to cope. If however you're photographing against more of a, say, a tree background, for example, maybe the background's not too far away, then it may be better to go to a smaller focus area, maybe just one focus point, and it might be better to change the responsiveness to more locked on, which is a negative, just to help it keep locked on to the bird. One of the best things about red kites is that they just adopt so many different poses when they go into a dive, so you can get so many different images. Sometimes the wings will be more stretched out, sometimes they're completely swept back as they're swooping down. You can get them twisting, turning, almost upside down on occasion. So that means there's just so many pictures to take, so much variety, and you'll never get bored. I mentioned earlier about technique when the birds start to circle and then drop. You also want to try and watch for any changes in sort of body behaviour, body language. So if you see the birds sort of, sometimes they like drop the shoulder, they're going to go into a dive. Any just sort of changes in the body position probably indicate they're about to go into a dive. Maybe look at the head as well. Do they suddenly start looking down more? Just look for any changes in sudden change of direction and speed. For these shots, I would definitely prefer full manual exposure wherever possible. So I'll select the shutter speed and the aperture as I want them, and then I'll simply select the ISO to balance everything to give me the correct exposure. I hardly ever use the widest aperture when I'm photographing red kites in this way. If I'm using the 300mm f4 lens, then I'd probably use anything from f5 to f8. Something in that region just gives me a little bit more depth of field, and potentially it's making the image a bit sharper as well. If you do have a clear blue sky, then it can help you a little bit to use that in terms of your exposure meter and the histogram. If it's a really nice clear blue sky, then that peak on the histogram should be around the middle, if not slightly to the left of the histogram. Now if you're photographing against a lighter sky, then you'll probably need to add a bit of overexposure, maybe about +1. One of the problems with photographing birds in flight is often the shadow areas that you get underneath the bird can be really frustrating. However, in this case, the birds actually help you out, and that's because when they start to go into their dive, they'll turn their body, but it just catches the light so much better, and you tend to have less shadows because the positions of the wings, there's not as much shadow area to throw onto the body. So once they actually go into that full dive, then you can get really nice even lighting across the bird. The frames per second, which I mentioned earlier, you want to keep this as high as you can. For this kind of shot, you really want to maximize that. So if I was using my Canon 1DX, I'd automatically just put it on its maximum frames per second, which is 12. On my Canon R6, I'm actually using the electronic shutter for these type of action shots, and I've used it recently and got a series of shots. It was really, really good. I get 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, and I definitely feel like that helps me to improve the success rate with my recent diving kite pictures. Now you might experience what some people would call blackout. It might not necessarily be the right term, but what looks like blackout or lag using electronic shutter, I don't really feel like I get that. I think it's fine for me. You might experience this more with mechanical shutter if you're using certain lenses, like older lenses. So I'm actually experiencing this a bit at the moment. I'll probably talk about it in another video. Is I'm getting what looks like a lag blackout between frames when I'm using my old EF lenses with mechanical shutters. And if you can, with red kites, as always, try and consider something different as opposed to the common pictures you see of them against blue skies. Maybe you're in a situation where you could try some panning, like some motion blur shots. Don't see those too often. Or maybe even some silhouettes. I've got a location close to here where it's possible to do silhouettes of kites in flight, which can be fantastic if you get a good sunset and a colourful sky. So as always, try and experiment. If you enjoyed the tips in this video, then check out this video here on photographing red kites and also perched red kites feeding and in the snow. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.